Hello guys, my name is Piers and today we're going to see a safer way to inject scoped services to our Blazor server components. First of all, I want to say that I'm talking about the classic Blazor server applications with no pre-render mode, the classic one that when you make a request to the page, you open a signal R connection and all the interactions you have with the server happens through that signal R connection. I have a video about Blazor server lifetimes and how they can be tricky. I'll put a link in the description below, but long story short, since when we change to a different page in a Blazor server applications, we don't actually make a request to the server. All the communication happens between that signal R connection. We don't actually have the concept of a scoped lifetime, and when we register a service as a scope, it behaves more as a singleton per user. And let me show you what I mean by that. I have a Blazor app that I creatively named Blazor app 1, and I have a services folder, and in here I have a GUID service. So I have a public GUID, the property called value, that we initialize when we initialize the service, and an interface for that service. And in my program.cs I register that iGUID service with its implementation as scoped. Now if I go to my components, first of all let me show you that I have the render mode to be an interactive server mode with a pre-render attribute to false. So if I go to my pages and to my home, I can now inject that iGUID service. So I will say inject iGUID service, GUID service, and in here instead of hello world I want to print the value of the GUID service, so GUID service.value. Now I will run the app and we have our GUID. It ends with 18b. I'll navigate to counter and back to home. Again the same GUID, 12b, weather, counter, back to home, and we get the same value every time. So that's not what we need, because we registered as scoped, and we did that because we wanted every time we navigate to the home page to get a new instance of that app. So we can do that by manually creating a scope, getting the service from that scope, and then dispose the scope, but the framework gives us a way to do that out of the box. I will remove that inject from here, and I will say that that home component inherits from the OwningComponentBase. And now that I did that, what I can do, I will first have a code section, and in here I will have a private iGUID service, and I will call that GUID service. And now I'm going to override the onInitialized method, and in here I will say GUID service equals with, and since we inherit from that OwningComponentBase, we have access to the scoped services property of that component base, and from there we can call the getService method, and we will specify the type of the service we need to get, and that's our iGUID service, and that should not be null. And now if I go in here and I say GUID service.value and I run my app again, we get that GUID that ends in F59. I'll go to counter, to home, and then we get another GUID. I'll navigate to weather and back to our home, and again we have a different GUID each time. So basically each time we navigate to our home page, we get a different instance of that service. So before I continue, let me show you another thing. If we only have one service to inject, and let me comment those out, we can pass a generic argument in here, and we can say that the service we want to inject is our iGUID service, and then we can call the service property of that OwningComponentBase, and as you can see it's an iGUID service, and we don't need to manually get the service from the scoped service property of the OwningComponentBase, but that works only if you have one service. So now let's go back to our previous code. Okay, and let's see how that scoped services works in the first place. So let's navigate in there. And as you can see, when we try to get that property, if the scope is null, it creates a new scope and then it returns the service provider of that scope. So basically the first time it creates a scope, and then if we need another service inside the same component, we get the same scope. And since that OwningComponentBase implements the iDisposable, when we navigate away from that home page in our example, that dispose method is called and it disposes the scope. So all the services we get back from that scope, they die. And that trick with services in Blazor server, it's something that we must be very careful about, because if you have a repository or a DB context or something that does data access, we don't want to inject a service that lives in our application until the user exited our app, closes the browser or navigate to a different web page. And having said that, although I like the simplicity of the OwningComponentBase, if I work with a Blazor server app and I do want to do data access, I will still not use that, because that repository, let's say, that I will have from the OwningComponentBase, it will live in my application until the user navigates to another page, and I don't control when they will do that. Instead, I prefer to create a scope, get my service, get or put the data, and then dispose that scope and that repository as well. Now I don't write all that code every time I need to get a service from the DI container. I have an abstraction for that, an abstraction that works with something like a user service that returns information about the identity of the user, because again, in Blazor server, when we have to do that and to get information for the identity of the user from the HTTP context, we can't do that as we would in other ASP.NET applications. If you want me to make a video about that, tell me in the comments and I will. And that, I think, concludes everything for that video. Thank you for watching and have a nice one.